Why didn't the German people rise up against Hitler? Were they all fanatic Nazis or a nation held hostage by an omnipresent secret police? The truth could be far more unsettling. What if they didn't resist because they simply didn't want to? I'm Spartacus Olson, and under the videos in my Death of Democracy series, I often see people wondering why the Germans didn't resist Hitler. Now, a popular misconceived answer is that an all-knowing, all-powerful Gestapo terrorized an unwilling population into submission. Another is that Germans were uniformly brainwashed. In reality, the Nazi regime relied on a complex web of targeted terror, social atomization, substantial popular support, and broad accommodation. But did the German people of the 1930s as a collective at least try or aspire to mount a meaningful resistance against the Nazi regime? While some very limited resistance did emerge, the answer is broadly no. Okay, to understand the lack of resistance, we must first abandon the myth of the Gestapo as an omnipresent force monitoring every citizen. In reality, the Gestapo was relatively small and understaffed, relying heavily on a flood of voluntary civilian denunciations to track down enemies of the state, many of which did not lead to formal prosecution. Instead, terror in the Third Reich was highly selective. From 1933, the violence of the SA and soon the SS concentration camp system was unleashed brutally, but primarily against specific targets: communists, politically active social democrats, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocials, Sinti and Roma, the clergy, and many more. In all, about 500,000 would be murdered, 500,000 forced into exile from Reich territory, and several 100,000 incarcerated. Terrible numbers, but in terms of share of the population of the expanded German Reich, a low single-digit percentage. For most non-targeted Germans, terror was not experienced as a daily personal threat in the same way it was for designated enemies. Instead, many citizens approved of this targeted repression, grateful that the regime was cleaning up the streets and restoring order after the political chaos of the Weimar years. Chaos that, one should note, the Nazis were a major instigator of. In any case, the initial Nazi power grab was swift and brutal, paralyzing the opposition. The political left was decimated by mass arrests in early 1933, sending a clear message that resistance was suicidal. Meanwhile, the traditional conservative elites, the army, the civil service, and big business, who possessed the institutional power to halt Hitler, capitulated and collaborated, sharing the Nazis' desire to crush Marxism and reverse the Versailles Treaty. Then, Germany underwent a radical transformation called the Gleichschaltung, or coordination, synchronization, something like that, which systematically brought all institutions, from labor unions to culture clubs, under Nazi control. Thus, to solidify its rule, the regime successfully atomized society. By destroying the independence of social organizations, the Nazis severed the traditional bonds of solidarity that could have fostered collective resistance. With the gradual imposition of authoritarian order, Germans comfortably retreated into the private sphere, with anyone opposed to the Nazis leading double lives where public conformity was traded for private survival. This inner emigration neutralized potential opposition. When ordinary Germans did grumble about shortages or low wages, their complaints rarely translated into political resistance. Most of anyone who may have wanted to resist had by then become isolated individuals, fearful of their neighbors and stripped of the means to organize. One of the central parts that eroded even the will to resist was the regime's undeniable early successes, which neutralized lingering doubts and bought the complicity of those whom historian Mary Fulbrook has called the muddled middle in a bystander society. An early perceived victory was that unemployment dropped from 6 million in 1932 to around 1.5 million by 1936. This recovery, while artificially fueled by rearmament and public works and based on statistical manipulation of labor data, felt like a miracle to a yearning population. As the exiled Social Democratic leadership, Sopade, reluctantly reported in 1938. Hitler has got the approval of a majority of the nation on two vital questions. He has created work, and he has made Germany strong. The apparent material recovery of the national economy was coupled with spectacular, bloodless foreign policy triumphs. The reintroduction of conscription in 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, and the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938 restored German national pride. The Hitler myth separated the Führer from the unpopular abuses of his party, allowing citizens to revere the leader while blaming his subordinates for any injustices. But why were so many even ready to embrace Hitler in the first place? Well, the defeat in the Great War and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles, although in many ways self-inflicted, was a profound collective trauma on the German people, stripping them of their status as a great international power and imposing deeply resented territorial, military, and economic restrictions. The sudden collapse of the monarchy and the imposition of the war guilt clause engendered a widespread sense of international marginalization and victimhood, convincing many Germans that their nation had been humiliated and unjustly cheated of victory by malign internal and external forces. A feeling set in among traditionally minded Germans that Germanness, their national identity, was threatened, perhaps even ending. This trauma destroyed the brief illusion of national unity experienced in 1914, leaving a fractured society, reeling from political chaos, economic disaster, and a deep feeling of loss of traditional identity. A modern concept that may help illuminate this dynamic is what Dan M. Cahan calls identity protective cognition, a tendency to unconsciously interpret, accept, or reject evidence in ways that protect one's status within a valued group. In a radicalized, non-fact-based society, this can turn factual correction into a perceived act of betrayal, so falsehoods that signal loyalty spread, while unwelcome truths are treated as enemy propaganda. While that is a current thesis drawn from current societal observation, it can be used carefully to somewhat better understand the reactions in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And so, this pervasive sense of national decline and alienation laid the psychological groundwork for the acceptance of Adolf Hitler's regime and unquestioning of its obvious propaganda lies. Without the trauma of war, revolution, and national humiliation, Hitler's radical message may very well have struggled to find an audience. Instead, he masterfully exploited these deep-seated fears and resentments by promising to tear up the Versailles settlement, restore Germany's rightful dominance in the world, and unite the fragmented population within a supposedly egalitarian racial Volksgemeinschaft, national community. By tapping into the desperate yearning to reverse their perceived international isolation and regain a proud national identity, the Nazis secured the complicity and support of millions of ordinary Germans who had come to value national resurgence and order above democratic liberties in short order. If you follow my Death of Democracy series, you will have heard quotes by non-Nazi German civilians expressing exactly this already in the first weeks of the regime's rule. Even people that were on the list of enemies, like Hamburg diarist Luise Solmetz, married to a baptized Jew, enthusiastically supported Hitler's national awakening. A young Social Democrat Party functionary, who would soon be a victim of the Nazis, initially expressed admiration and relief that Germany was being restored to her perceived former greatness, and so on. For those who did oppose the regime, the speed and totality of the Nazi takeover induced profound shock and paralysis. As the young lawyer Sebastian Haffner observed in 1933, the traditional opposition organization simply folded. There was not one single example of energetic defense, of courage, or principle. There was only panic, flight, and desertion. By the time the true criminal nature of the regime became glaringly obvious, such as during the state-sponsored Kristallnacht pogrom of November 9th and 10th, 1938, society was compliant or silenced. While many Germans expressed private disgust at the violence, fear and mutual distrust prevented them from even attempting any collective action. Historian Robert Gleichschaltung notes that many ordinary people served as the eyes and ears of the police, effectively creating a self-policing society where organized resistance was reduced to a tiny minority and mass resistance never emerged. Furthermore, the regime offered the compelling, inclusive vision of the Volksgemeinschaft, which promised social equality and national unity for Aryan Germans provided they conformed. This community was inherently exclusionary, requiring the persecution of outsiders. But for those inside it, the psychological rewards were immense, enhancing the identity-protective cognition I mentioned earlier. By September 1939, when Hitler plunged Europe into war, the German people was supportive of action against Poland, but did not want a general war and rightly feared that that was what was coming. But by now, the average German had been bound to the regime through a mixture of complicity, perceived prosperity, and an omnipresent, albeit selectively applied system of terror. So, what do the numbers suggest? By 1945, the Nazi Party's central membership files contained about 8.5 million NSDAP members, and millions more people belonged to affiliated Nazi organizations. At the same time, some 500,000 people were forced into exile from territories ruled by the Nazi dictatorship. Among the regime's designated victims within Germany and the annexed territories of the Reich, hundreds of thousands were imprisoned, and several 100,000 were murdered by 1945. But those categories overlap, so they cannot be added into one exact total. Nevertheless, it's a small percentage of Germans, and an even smaller percentage resisted. A contemporary Gestapo estimate puts outright opposition at only about 2 out of every 1,000 Germans. That leaves not a neatly measurable 85%, but a vast and varied muddled middle: believers, opportunists, careerists, conformists, grumblers, and frightened bystanders. Despite the fuzziness, we can say with some confidence that support and accommodation was substantial. After the war, there has been several attempts at quantifying Nazi support that seems to confirm that. In early 1945, an American investigator interviewing German POWs estimated their political views as 15% convinced Nazis, 75% opportunistic fellow travelers, and 10% anti-Nazis. In October 1945, a U.S. occupation survey revealed lingering widespread support for the regime, with 42% of youth and 22% of adults surveyed in Darmstadt claiming that Germany's reconstruction needed a strong new Führer. By the late 1940s, about half of the Germans surveyed in the British and American zones still believed National Socialism was a good idea badly carried out. As late as 1952, a quarter of the population still held a good opinion of Hitler, and in 1953, 14% admitted they would be willing to vote for a man like Hitler again. A 1993 sociological survey of 300 elderly residents in Cologne, a city known for its weak Nazi electoral support before 1933, found that 55% admitted to having genuinely believed in National Socialism during the Third Reich. This belief was notably higher among men, 71%, than women, 47%. Because the Nazis only won 44% of the national vote, and just 33% in Cologne, in the last contested election of March 1933, this post-war data strongly suggests that the regime successfully won over millions of new supporters after seizing power. In summary, the transformation of a modern democratic society into a compliant bedrock for totalitarianism rested on a cradle of national trauma and was implemented through a devastatingly effective combination of targeted coercion and engineered consent. The Nazi regime did not simply beat the German populace into submission, it co-opted a majority of them. By offering rapid economic stabilization and the restoration of national pride, the state fulfilled the immediate desires of large swaths of the populace. The regime systematically dismantled the structural foundations of civil society, isolating individuals and replacing independent social networks with mandatory state organizations. This Atomization meant that any remaining discontent remained fragmented and private, incapable of coalescing into a unified political force. Simultaneously, the terror apparatus operated with a veneer of legality, selectively targeting marginalized groups that the broader public already viewed with suspicion or apathy. Because the violence was directed outward at perceived enemies of the state, many citizens felt safe, and some even justified their complicity by utilizing the state's denunciation networks for personal gain. Thus, through a calculated mix of material reward, ideological seduction via the Volksgemeinschaft, and the normalization of exclusionary violence, the regime created a self-policing society where resistance became not only practically impossible, but to tens of millions, seemingly unnecessary. But does this absolve the German polity of the 1930s of responsibility? Does it make them all victims of Nazism, a flock of sheep led astray by a manipulative shepherd and his rabid sheepdogs? Not in my opinion. While we can explain their behavior, we can just as easily condemn their compliance and assign to them both agency and responsibility. In 1918, they were the founding generation of the Weimar Republic. They resisted the communist revolution that year, and a majority chose democracy. Despite that this majority's support for liberalism began to dwindle right after that, in 1920, they flooded the streets and went on general strike to stop the autocratic forces in the extreme right Kapp-Putsch. Thus, many Germans still stood fast for their democratic constitution and embraced its opening words. The German people, united in all their racial elements and inspired by the will to renew and strengthen their Reich in liberty and justice, to preserve peace at home and abroad, and to foster social progress, have established the following constitution. But while in the decade that followed, much of the German nation still lived vibrantly under these ideals, more and more Germans felt that the new age had not delivered what they had hoped for: renewed national honor, stability, order, and prosperity. And when faced with renewed struggles, they let their frustration loose on their perceived enemies to gratify their sense of illusionary safety and to validate their grievances. They did not fail to resist the Nazis. They failed to resist their own inner demons. They switched tolerance for each other for tolerance of the intolerant. They failed to choose hope, generosity, and compassion, and latched on to fear, egotism, and hatred. Their failure should remind us that democracy's greatest threat is not always the brute force of a dictator, but often the silent, comfortable acquiescence of the majority. Never forget.